For a brief moment, these children were some of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. Their faces were printed on posters, magazines, and theater marquees across America. And then somehow, many of them seemed to disappear. Not all at once, not always dramatically. Sometimes it happened quietly. A role dried up, a face changed, a studio lost interest. And suddenly, someone who had once been everywhere was just gone. That's the part old Hollywood rarely likes to remember. It knew how to manufacture child stars. What it never seemed very good at was protecting the children once the spotlight moved on. And some of these stories are much stranger, sadder, and darker than people realize. Bobby Driscoll. For a while, Bobby Driscoll looked untouchable. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, he wasn't just a working child actor, he was one of the most valuable young stars in Hollywood. Disney saw something in him that audiences immediately understood. He had that rare mix of sweetness, vulnerability, and mischief that made him feel completely real on screen. He became the face of films like Treasure Island and Peter Pan. And for a moment, it seemed like he had the kind of future studios dream about. But child stardom has always had a cruel expiration date. As Bobby got older, the image that made him profitable began to slip away. By his own later account, acne and the awkwardness of adolescence made him suddenly less marketable, and the industry that had once celebrated him moved on with startling speed. Disney dropped him, roles became harder to find, and the fall was brutal. His later life spiraled into addiction, arrests, and obscurity before he died tragically young in 1968. For someone once treated like Hollywood's golden boy, the ending was almost unbearably lonely. And if Bobby Driscoll's story feels especially cruel, the next one is disturbing for a different reason. Jackie Coogan. Before Shirley Temple, before Disney built entire empires around child performers, before Hollywood fully understood the commercial power of a child's face, there was Jackie Coogan. He became one of the earliest true child superstars after appearing alongside Charlie Chaplin in The Kid, and his fame exploded so quickly that it almost feels unreal now. He wasn't just famous, he was a phenomenon. Adults adored him, studios depended on him, and money poured in at a level most children could never even comprehend. On paper, Jackie Coogan had already won life before he was old enough to understand what was happening. Then he found out much of it was gone. When he became an adult, Coogan discovered that a huge portion of the fortune he had earned as a child had been spent by his mother and stepfather. The betrayal was so shocking that it eventually helped inspire California's Coogan Act, one of the earliest legal protections for child performers' earnings. That alone tells you how unprotected these kids really were. Hollywood knew how to profit from children long before it knew how to protect them. Coogan did eventually return to public memory later in life as Uncle Fester on The Addams Family. But the damage had already exposed one of old Hollywood's ugliest truths. And if Jackie Coogan's story revealed the financial side of child stardom, the next one shows something quieter, and in some ways sadder, what it looks like when someone simply decides they never want the spotlight again.
Oh, j'espère bien que ce n'est pas le smallpox.
The smallpox?
Maybe.
Virginia Weidler. Virginia Weidler had one of those faces classic movie fans never forget. She wasn't marketed in the same fairy tale way as some of the era's biggest child stars, but she had something arguably more valuable: personality. Real personality, sharp timing, emotional intelligence, and a kind of quick, natural energy that made her feel less like a studio invention and more like a real child accidentally dropped into a movie full of adults. By the early 1940s, she had built an impressive run of performances, including memorable work in films like The Philadelphia Story. And then she was gone. Not because of one giant scandal, not because of some dramatic tabloid collapse. She simply retired young and seemed to want almost nothing to do with revisiting that part of her life. After leaving acting, she gave no interviews for the rest of her life and lived largely outside the mythology machine that usually feeds on former stars. There's something eerie about that kind of disappearance. Not theatrical, not explosive, just a quiet closing of the door. In a business obsessed with visibility, Virginia Weidler became one of the more haunting examples of someone who simply stepped out of frame and stayed there. But not every child star vanished because Hollywood abandoned them. Freddie Bartholomew. Freddie Bartholomew had the kind of face old Hollywood loved to photograph. Elegant, vulnerable, impossibly polished. He didn't just look like a child star, he looked like the fantasy of one. In the 1930s, MGM turned him into one of the era's defining young actors through films like David Copperfield, Captains Courageous, and Little Lord Fauntleroy. He had the rare ability to seem heartbreakingly fragile without ever feeling artificial, and for a while it looked like he had one of the safest futures of any child performer in Hollywood. But his image came with a trap built into it. Freddie's appeal was so tied to his boyish refinement that once he started growing up, the illusion became harder to preserve. And behind the scenes, his life had already become tangled in ugly custody and legal battles involving relatives who fought over his career and money. By the time he reached adulthood, the industry no longer seemed sure what to do with him. He kept working in smaller ways, and eventually built a life outside the fantasy that once made him famous. But the shift is still striking. One of MGM's most carefully manufactured child stars didn't implode in public. He simply stopped fitting the role Hollywood had invented for him, and was quietly left behind. But some child stars didn't vanish because they were fragile. Some disappeared because they were too strong, too self-possessed, and too capable of seeing through the illusion. Jane Withers. Jane Withers was never the delicate porcelain doll type Hollywood usually preferred in little girls. That's part of what made her so memorable. She was loud, funny, sharp, stubborn, and completely capable of stealing attention from adults twice her age. After getting a major boost appearing opposite Shirley Temple in Bright Eyes, she became a star in her own right through a string of films that leaned into her comic confidence. She wasn't just adorable, she had attitude. And for a while that made her one of the most distinctive child performers in the business. But child stardom can be strangely unforgiving to personality. The very qualities that made Jane Withers stand out as a child didn't automatically translate into the kind of glamorous adult career Hollywood usually rewarded. She never really became one of the tragic lost girls of the studio era, but she did become something else. A reminder of how quickly even highly successful child stars could be reclassified once they no longer fit the fantasy audiences first bought into. She kept working, reinvented herself more than once, and later became familiar to entirely new generations through television. But her story still carries that unmistakable old Hollywood pattern. The industry loved her intensely as a child, then seemed far less interested once she was no longer required to stay one forever. And if Jane Withers shows what happens when a child star survives the machine, the next story is more haunting, because this one involves a voice, a face, and a career that once looked too perfect to simply fade. Gloria Jean. For a while, Gloria Jean looked like one of those stars the studios assumed would last forever. She had the voice, the charm, the polished sweetness, and the kind of carefully packaged innocence that made her easy to sell during a difficult era. Universal promoted her heavily in the late 1930s and 1940s, often positioning her as a kind of fresh, youthful musical sensation, the sort of performer audiences could fall in love with immediately. She wasn't just another child in the background. She was being shaped into a full-fledged attraction. And then the future got smaller. As the years passed, the glamour around Gloria Jean began to thin out in a way that feels strangely sad in hindsight. She kept working, but not with the same force or prestige that once seemed possible. And later in life, one of the details people fixated on most wasn't a triumphant comeback. It was the shock of discovering that a former star had at one point worked an ordinary job far from the image audiences had once projected onto her. That contrast says a lot about how people think fame is supposed to work. Hollywood can make a child feel unforgettable, but it has never been very good at preparing anyone for what happens when the applause ends and life becomes ordinary again. But if Gloria Jean's story feels quietly melancholy, the next one cuts deeper. Because this child star didn't just lose momentum. She had one of the clearest "why isn't she still famous" careers in the entire video.
I hear you got an Oscar.
Yes, I did. I won one too. It hasn't grown up yet, you know.
Peggy Ann Garner. Peggy Ann Garner had everything that should have carried her much further. She wasn't just cute, and she wasn't just marketable, she could really act. In the 1940s, that became impossible to ignore. Her performance in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn was so strong that it helped earn her a Special Academy Award. And for a while, it looked like Hollywood had found one of those rare child stars who might actually survive the transition into something deeper and more lasting. She had emotional weight. She had screen presence. She had exactly the kind of early acclaim most performers spend their whole lives chasing. And still, it somehow wasn't enough. That's what makes her story so unsettling. Peggy Ann Garner didn't disappear because she lacked talent. If anything, she had too much of it too early, before the industry really knew how to build a stable future around a child once the novelty faded. Adult roles never arrived with the same force her childhood success seemed to promise, and like so many former child stars, she eventually had to build a life outside the fantasy people assumed would carry her forever. There's something especially cruel about stories like hers. Hollywood saw the brilliance. It even rewarded it. It just never really knew how to protect it once the child stopped being a child.